It's 4:07 in the afternoon, Friday, May 31st, 1889. A woman on the second floor of her house in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, hears something she can't quite name. A vibration more than a sound. The windows rattle. Her dog won't stop barking. Then she sees it. Coming down the valley, filling it, wall to wall, a wave of black water 36 feet high, carrying houses, railroad cars and trees, moving at 40 miles an hour. She has about 10 seconds. 20 million tons of water hit Johnstown in under 10 minutes. By nightfall, more than 2,200 people were dead. And the thing that's haunted this story for over a century is that every single person who could have stopped it didn't. Stand here with me for a second, because this geography is everything. Johnstown, Pennsylvania, 60 miles east of Pittsburgh, tucked into a narrow valley in the Allegheny Mountains where two rivers meet, the Little Chronova and Stony Creek. Steep hills on every side, one way in, one way out, and the whole town sitting on a floodplain. 14 miles upstream and 450 feet higher in elevation. You can see it on this map. There's a lake, Lake Chronova, about 2 miles long, a mile wide, 60 feet deep at the dam. Roughly 20 million tons of water, held back by an earthen embankment that had been modified, neglected, and patched with mud and straw for the better part of a decade. By the time that water started moving, it had nowhere to go except straight through Johnstown. What made this flood unstoppable wasn't just the storm. There were 3 decisions made years before that Friday that turned a dangerous situation into a catastrophe. And by the end of this video, you'll know exactly what they were, who made them, and why not one of those people ever paid a single dollar in damages. But first, you need to know what this town was. Because the 30,000 people who woke up that Friday morning aren't background characters. They were steelworkers, immigrants, children. They had parades and opera houses and roller skating rinks. They had routines. And they had one thing in common. They'd heard the dam break rumors for years, and the dam had never broken. Johnstown was founded in 1800 by a Swiss immigrant named Joseph Johns. His actual name was Shantz, but America had a habit of anglicizing that sort of thing. By the 1850s, the Pennsylvania Railroad had come through, and the Cambria Iron Works was turning the town into one of the most productive steel-making communities in the country. Welsh and German immigrants poured into the valley. By 1889, the population had grown from 1,269 people to nearly 30,000. The town had 36 churches, 20 schools, 2 opera houses, a library, a park, and a roller skating rink. It was a real city, a proud one. It also flooded, regularly. The rivers had overflowed 7 times between 1880 and 1888 alone. People had a system, move the rugs upstairs, wait it out, clean up after. Flooding was inconvenient. It wasn't frightening. That familiarity matters. Because when the warnings came on May 31st, people had a reference point. And that reference point was wrong. The dam had broken before, back in 1862. It had been repaired. It had held through every storm since. Eyewitness Victor Heiser, then a teenager in Johnstown, later captured the mood perfectly. Sometime that dam will give way, but it won't ever happen to us. Which raises the question that everyone eventually asks about Johnstown. Who was responsible for that dam, and what had they actually done to it? In 1879, the dam and the lake behind it were purchased by a group of wealthy Pittsburgh industrialists who wanted somewhere private to fish. They formed the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club. Membership cost around $800 to join, plus $50 in annual dues, which in the wage economy of 1889 was roughly 25% more than a typical industrial worker earned in an entire year. Among the 60 or so members, Andrew Carnegie, Henry Clay Frick, Andrew Mellon, and Philander Knox, who would later become US Attorney General. These were among the most powerful men in America. They built cottages along the lake. They held regattas and fishing tournaments. They had a clubhouse that could sleep over 200 guests. By all accounts, it was a beautiful retreat. The dam was theirs to maintain. And this is where those three decisions come in. Decision 1, the discharge pipes. The original dam had 5 cast iron pipes running through its base, the mechanism that let engineers drain the lake and control water levels if a serious storm was coming. Before the club even took ownership, a previous owner had removed those pipes and sold them for scrap. The club never replaced them. Without those pipes, there was no practical way to lower the lake ahead of a storm. Decision 2, the crest. To build a wider carriage road across the top of the dam, the club lowered its height by approximately 2 to 3 feet. That reduction directly cut the dam's capacity to handle overflow without being breached. Decision 3, the fish screens. Metal screens were placed across the spillway openings to stop the club's prize fish from escaping into the river. Those screens trapped debris. Debris blocked drainage. The effective spillway width dropped from what the original design intended down to under 40 feet. 3 decisions, each one made by someone, for some reason, at the time. And together, they killed more than 2,200 people. All that was needed now was the right storm. In May 1889, it arrived. On May 28th, a low-pressure system formed over Nebraska. Over 2 days, it tracked east, and by the time it hit western Pennsylvania, it had become, according to US Army Signal Corps records, among the heaviest rainfall events ever recorded in that region. Between 6 and 10 inches of rain fell in roughly 24 hours. The night of May 30th into the early morning of the 31st, the rain came down without stopping. Small creeks became torrents. Telegraph lines went down. Rail lines washed away. In Johnstown, the usual spring flooding was already underway. Streets under 2 to 7 feet of water in places. Businesses let workers go home early. People moved things to the second floor. Same as always. Up at the dam, 14 miles away, the situation was completely different. Colonel Elias Unger, the club's president, had watched the lake rise more than 2 feet overnight. He sent a telegram warning to Johnstown. The dam was close to overflowing. The message arrived. People had heard it before. Nobody evacuated. John Park, a young civil engineering student at the club, was watching the water rise at roughly an inch every 10 minutes. He knew what overtopping meant for an earthen dam. Once water ran across the top, it would cut through the embankment like a knife through wet sand. He and the workers tried desperately to raise the dam's height, dig new spillways, tear out the fish screens. The water was moving faster than any of it could help. Park rode to the nearest telegraph station and sent warnings downstream. He then got on a horse and rode toward Johnstown, shouting as he went. Other riders joined him. The warnings reached the town, multiple times, across multiple hours. Nobody moved. The dam had always held. Around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the lake water began spilling over the top of the dam. Within the hour, the entire center gave way. 20 million tons of water tore through the gap and began moving down the valley. It reached Johnstown in less than an hour. The water that left the dam wasn't just water. By the time it had traveled a few miles, it had picked up entire houses, railroad cars, factory rooftops, telegraph poles, livestock and trees. It was moving at roughly 40 miles an hour. The wave was between 36 and 40 feet high. South Fork was hit first, the small town just below the dam, then Mineral Point, then East Conemaugh, where a Pennsylvania Railroad locomotive engineer named John Hess heard the wave coming, opened his throttle, and blew his whistle continuously for as long as he could, buying some residents a few extra seconds to run for the hills. The wave caught his engine anyway. By the time the water reached Woodvale, just upstream of Johnstown, it had been in motion for nearly an hour, and it had swallowed everything in the valley above. The wave that hit Johnstown wasn't just 20 million tons of water. It was 20 million tons of water and an entire demolished landscape. In Johnstown, at 4:07 in the afternoon, people heard it before they saw it. A low rumble that grew into something like thunder coming from the wrong direction, from up the valley. Some knew immediately. They ran. They grabbed whoever was nearest and made for the hills. Most had seconds, not minutes. Victor Heiser was 16 years old. He was in his family's barn when the wave hit, and from the second-floor window, he watched it take his parents. He climbed onto the barn roof as it began to float, then surfed the debris for hours, leaping from rooftop to rooftop across a moving landscape until he reached safety on higher ground. He lived to become a renowned public health physician. He wrote about that afternoon decades later with the kind of clinical distance that only comes from having had no other choice but to keep going. Gertrude Quinn was 6 years old. She was thrown onto a floating mattress and carried through the wreckage of her own street before a man on a makeshift raft pulled her to safety. She described it years later the way a child might, matter-of-factly, the horror buried somewhere under the strange calm of memory. Reverend Chapman was trapped in his attic with his wife and several neighbors as the water filled the floor below them. He wrote afterwards, "None of us was afraid to meet God, but we all felt willing to put it off until a more propitious time." In under 10 minutes, most of downtown Johnstown was gone. The flood hit the Pennsylvania Railroad stone bridge at the edge of town, and it acted like a sieve. Boxcars, house timbers, factory rooftops, barbed wire from the destroyed Gautier Wire Works, animals, and people, alive and dead, piled up against it. The jam grew to 40 feet high and 30 acres wide. Then it caught fire, probably from overturned stoves still hot from afternoon cooking. No one ever determined it exactly, but the debris pile burned through the night, while survivors on the hillsides above listened. Some of the people trapped in the wreckage were still alive when the flames reached them. Contemporary newspaper accounts describe the fire burning with all the fury of hell. Many people died at the bridge, some of them still inside their own homes, carried whole into the jam. When dawn came on June 1st, the water had receded. What it left behind was almost impossible to describe. Streets were buried in mud and rubble up to the 3rd story. Entire city blocks had simply ceased to exist. The Johnstown Tribune, somehow still operating, began printing lists of the dead and missing. They filled column after column after column. The death toll settled at least 2,209 people. 396 of them were children. 99 entire families were wiped out completely. No survivors at all. 1/3 of the bodies, 777 people, were never identified. They were buried together in a communal plot at Grandview Cemetery, called the Plot of the Unknown. Bodies were found as far away as Cincinnati, Ohio. The last ones were recovered in 1911, 22 years later. The Johnstown flood remains to this day the deadliest dam disaster in American history, and at the time, one of the largest single-day losses of civilian life the country had ever seen. Typhoid followed. Disease spread through the waterlogged wreckage and added 40 more deaths to the toll. Emergency hospitals and morgues were set up in whatever buildings still stood. The nation responded on a scale that stunned even the relief workers. Americans and people from 18 foreign countries donated more than $3.7 million, over $100 million in today's money. Queen Victoria sent condolences to President Benjamin Harrison. 5 days after the flood, Clara Barton arrived with 50 doctors and nurses from the American Red Cross, an organization founded just 8 years earlier in 1881. This was its first major peacetime disaster response. Barton stayed for 5 months. Her team built what they called Red Cross hotels, temporary shelters and infirmaries for the thousands left with nothing. They served roughly 25,000 survivors. The operational lessons learned in Johnstown shaped disaster relief in America for generations. But while the relief effort was underway, another question was building. And it was the one question that has followed Johnstown ever since. Once the shock wore off, people wanted someone to answer for it, and all roads led to the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club. The engineering investigation was unambiguous. The modifications to the dam, the removed discharge pipes, the lowered crest, the fish screens blocking the spillway, the inadequate repairs to the sagging center, had together made it structurally unable to handle the kind of storm that May 1889 delivered. The Pennsylvania Adjutant General called it criminal negligence. A Chicago newspaper headline asked simply, manslaughter or murder? Survivors filed suit. Multiple lawsuits against the club and its members. Every single one failed. The courts relied on the act of God defense, treating the unprecedented rainfall as the primary cause of the disaster. Proving personal negligence against individual members required meeting a standard of proof that, in practice, courts of the era did not apply to wealthy property owners in this way. The legal concept of negligence existed. Applying it in this case against these men in 1889, that was a different matter entirely. Not one member of the club paid a single dollar in legal damages to a single victim. Several of them, including Carnegie and Frick, made large personal donations to the relief effort. Carnegie would later fund the rebuilding of Johnstown's library. Historians have noted the strange dynamic that created. The people many blamed most visibly were also among the most visible in the recovery. What the lawsuits couldn't achieve in court, they arguably achieved in the law itself. The public fury that followed the Johnstown verdicts contributed, over the following decades, to changes in American tort law that established what we now recognize as modern liability for negligence. Today, you can be held legally accountable for harm caused by your recklessness, even if you never intended the harm. Johnstown is part of the reason for that. The Cambria Iron Works partially reopened on June 6th, 6 days after the flood. Within a month, businesses on Main Street were back open. Within 5 years, the city had been rebuilt so completely that visitors said you could barely tell anything had happened. But something had shifted. Johnstown flooded again seriously in 1936 and again in 1977. The geography that made it valuable, that narrow valley, those two rivers, kept making it vulnerable. Federal money rebuilt it each time, but industry moved on. Today, Johnstown's population is a fraction of what it was in 1889. At Grandview Cemetery, the plot of the unknown still holds 777 people whose names were never confirmed. They have one shared headstone, no individual markers, just the date and the number. The South Fork Dam site still exists. You can visit it as part of the Johnstown Flood National Memorial, run by the National Park Service. The land has grown over in the centuries since, but if you know where to look, you can still see the outline of where the lake was, the shape of where all that water sat, waiting. The Johnstown flood killed more than 2,200 people in under 10 minutes on a Friday afternoon in May. It happened because of a storm, because of geography, and because of 3 quiet decisions made by powerful people who never lived in the valley below. The families who did live there rebuilt anyway. They rebuilt the city, rebuilt their lives, and without setting out to, they helped reshape American law. Not through speeches or monuments, just by showing up in court over and over and refusing to let the story be buried alongside their dead. That's what I keep coming back to with Johnstown. The scale of the loss is almost too large to hold in your head. But the response, the stubbornness of it, the refusal to simply disappear, that part is clear. They stayed. If this video gave you something, consider subscribing to Chronova Files. Every video, we take a forgotten corner of history, rebuild it with AI, and tell it the way it deserves to be told. Like if this story mattered to you. I'll see you in the next one.